Huge shout out to the sponsor of this year at Books You Haven't Read Studios, Procrastination. Procrastination has been a longtime sponsor both of this show and of my life, and really just can't envision doing any of this or having any of this made possible without their help. Thank you so much. Hello, my name is Books You Haven't Read. Welcome to Nate Rankin. Today, I am going to be doing my 2022 year-in read-view. No, terrible. I'm going to talk about the books that I read in 2022, my reading goal list for this year, what I hit, what I didn't hit, as well as some other books of note that I read. And then at the end, I'm going to briefly talk about some goals I have both for my reading list this next year, as well as for book video making. So let's get into it. Let's start off with the books that I did not complete. So the first one, I had a goal to read one of two William T. Vollmann books, either Fathers and Crows, which is the second in the Dream series, or You Bright and Risen Angels, which is his first novel. Didn't get to either of those. The reason I didn't mainly was because in September I chose to do Darkenville's Cat. I did a video on that, and that was a group read. And so I didn't really feel like doing another sort of big linguistic chonker after that. I wanted to kind of slow down and have some shorter stuff to read after that. Also, another book I didn't get to was Divine Days by Leon Forrest. That was, I thought I could do all the other 9. I set 10 goals for myself, and that was kind of the big bonus, and I thought, why not shoot high? Didn't even come close. I think I read the first page of that book. And then finally, the third book I didn't get to was Through the Arc of the Rainforest by Karente Yamashita. That wasn't like a huge... I just didn't end up feeling a great pull toward it. I kind of had the opportunity to at the end of the year, but I ultimately chose a couple different smaller books of similar length. Maybe I'll get to it in the next year. Moving on to the stuff that I did read. A couple of these I have done some form of video on, so I will direct you to that. Especially the first one was The Pale King by David Foster Wallace. Awesome book, love it still. Read it for the first time 10 years ago. Read it as a buddy read with my buddy Luke, and I did basically like a 2-hour podcast with him on that. So you can go and check that out. It was done earlier this year. I think I posted in February. Second book I completed on my list was Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. Interesting reading experience, right? This was an audiobook, I should say, first of all. And Galeano is one of my all-time favorite fiction writers. And this is a history book that is very much written like a novel. And unfortunately, I think it's worse for it, which is not to say that it's bad. It kind of made me appreciate the way in which a lot of the history books that I typically read, which are also typically audiobooks, how they're sort of laid out and organized. It's funny, it's a bit different. It's like his normal writing style, but more dense. There's just more detail in it, and his sort of brief poetic way of writing fiction is much more pleasing to me. The book is a history of the economic exploitation of Latin America, mostly focused on South America as well as portions of Central America, and it focuses on how huge swaths of the world, namely the US and Europe, got rich off the backs of this continent. If I had kind of one main critique with it, it's that it goes kind of in chronological order, but not quite. And so there's a little bit of hopping around that I think ultimately makes it a little more disorganized than it needs to be. Otherwise, super interesting. It's got a little, it's a work of history and journalism, but it's also got a lot of kind of vinegar and invective that you might expect from a young leftist journalist. As a counterpart to that book, I also read the other 2 volumes in Galeano's Memory of Fire trilogy. I had read Genesis, and I've done a literary mixtape earlier this year, which you can check out. But I also read Faces and Masks, as well as Century of the Wind. I had planned to do 2 videos on these, which would be much like the Genesis mixtape. But quite honestly, there didn't seem to be a huge response to that first one that I did, so I was like, I'll put it on the back burner for now. I do still want to do them. They are a really incredible trilogy altogether, though by the end, it's so much of the same thing that it's a bit of a slog by the end, but still very impressive work. Highly recommend both the writer and that trilogy. Another book that was on my list was Wayward by Dana Spiotta, and honestly, this one was pretty disappointing for me. Dana Spiotta is one of these authors that I've read every novel of hers. I'm not sure if she has a short story collection, but I've read every novel of hers. This was the one I hadn't. The setup for this novel is kind of intriguing. A wife leaves her husband shortly after the election of Donald Trump. Interesting book jacket, right? But not necessarily a full novel. One of the things this book probes a couple different ways is like problematic feminists or, maybe problematic feminism. The main character works at like a historical house or museum for a fictional first wave feminist named Clara Loomis. This Clara Loomis, while she was a feminist, was also a racist and a eugenicist. So that's not necessarily like a huge part of the plot, but thematically, it does kind of reverberate throughout the novel. The wife herself, whose name is Sam, or the wife/mother, I should say, she mostly gets a divorce kind of based on impulse. It's not so much something that her husband has done to her or that's happening at home as it is she's just reached her limit. There comes this very confused just struggle with that. Like, she's constantly trying to justify her decision on kind of like her own internal feminist scorecard. And she's also reflecting on how she's probably being a bad mother to her child. Her daughter, by the way, is a super high achieving kid that's 17 years old, applying for colleges, getting ready for just that huge season in her life, and also is secretly dating a nearly 30-year-old man. And I do use dating deliberately because I think that's kind of how Spiotta wants to frame it. Even though, there are obvious age of consent issues going on here, but we get, close third POVs of both the mother and the daughter. Spiotta is trying to show you the very deliberate decisions that the girl is making, and is trying to complicate that Me Too moment. I can see what she was going for, right? It's set up that you suspect that within this affair, possible grooming situation between this older man and the daughter, that someone's going to get punished, right? You assume that there is punishment, more likely because of kind of what we've seen, more likely for the daughter than for the man. But eventually what happens, spoiler alert, is that after basically a whole novel's worth of her sneaking around with this guy, they go out in public. I think it's at a fair or something. Get it? A fair. The mom sort of catches them from afar. They don't necessarily think she catches them. They think they just escape, but we get her perspective in a later chapter, and she did indeed see them. But basically, they get kind of caught in public once, and it spooks them both. I mean, it spooks the guy, and he's like, I can't do this. We can't do this. And with the girl, she's just like, well, this guy's kind of a pathetic loser dating a 17-year-old. Who gives a shit? And so there is this kind of weird letdown of, what? There's no punishment? Which I do accept is probably kind of the point. But I don't know. It just felt very sort of inconsequential at the end of it all to me. Probably my least favorite Spiotta novel so far. Definitely haven't given up on her as a writer as a whole. Let's see, another big one on my list was The Dawn of Everything by Davids Graeber and Wengrow. I did a 30-minute video on this. You can go view it. I also did a video on At Swim Two Birds by Flann O'Brien. This has been a long time coming, and is part of my kind of broader, I had kind of a mini dive into sort of a self-selection of different Irish reads this year, which I'll talk about a little more in just a few minutes. Finally, on my reading list, I had Something New Under the Sun by Alexandra Kleeman, which is her second novel. her follow-up to You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine. This is a bizarre little novel. Don't know that I would recommend this one as much as her first novel. It's cli-fi, it's climate fiction. The reader is placed in a near future, kind of oncoming climate apocalypse novel. I'll be very interested to see how this holds up or how this reads in like 10 or 20 years, because it really does feel like it's meant to be contemporary. It's a little bit of an exaggerated apocalyptic parable for sort of our time right now. So there's a water shortage in the western half of the United States, I think most of the western half of the United States, so that residents now have to drink this thing called Wat-R, which has different chemicals, and it gives it a slightly weird taste, and there's growing evidence that you get sort of this rapid onset dementia or amnesia if you drink too much of it. Patrick Hamlin is a writer, and he's a novelist, and one of his books is getting made into a movie, and so he goes out to Los Angeles to kind of pursue that. Meanwhile, his daughter and his wife, they've kind of separated from him, and they have gone to like this sort of commune in upstate New York, where they sort of ritualistically mourning the ongoing death of the planet. Like, it hasn't even happened. They live in a place that so far has been untouched by it, but they in the morning they'll go through here are the latest climate catastrophes, and let's all feel sad about it, which is very American response to probably what is going to happen. I think this book is best to be read, like I said, as a parable. There is, I don't know if this is quite like an unbelievability problem with it, but it may be just by the fact that it centers the demise of the Western climate and of the first world problems of Western people. I don't know if I necessarily buy that particularly. Now, I say this as a West Coast elitist that lives in Southern California. I don't necessarily think that the people in Southern California are going to have to pay any kind of price for climate change. Certainly not in the near future. Oh no, we might get yelled at by our governor to take shorter showers or something. That's some hubris. Let's see if this comes to bite me in the ass. I don't think it necessarily delegitimizes the book, but there is something just a little goofy, I don't necessarily buy into it. I will say that the writing in this book, Kleeman's writing generally is really good. Or no, if I were writing a blurb for this book, I would say something stupid like the prose sparkles in a way the Wat-R does not. And so I think she's a hell of a good writer. I'm very interested to see what else is coming out in the future. I audiobooked a trio of biographies this year, 2 of them writers, one of them leader of the Russian Federation. The first one was The Man with No Face, and that is by Masha Gessen. It is about Vladimir Putin. The big takeaway from this was that Putin was largely consistent in who he has always been. He's always been proud of being a bully and a thug, and at different times, the West and the international community has projected who they want to see onto him. It's also really interesting to see how, so I have read, one of the things I'm trying to do is read biographies of all the major leaders of Russia since the Russian Revolution. And so I've read one on Lenin, I've read this one on Putin now. I have one I'm going to read on Stalin, and I'm hoping to read a Khrushchev one as well after that. It's really interesting to me how often the figure of competent, low-profile bureaucrat keeps rising to the top in that country. Something about that. There are just some interesting parallels between he and Stalin, what I know about Stalin. Second biography was Shakespeare, the biography by Peter Ackroyd. This was a really awesome read. I listened to this a bunch while I was in Ireland. The tricky thing with a Shakespeare biography is, how exactly you're going to fill out the pages, because we don't have a lot of primary sources around Shakespeare the man. And so it's filled out with a lot of broader history of what that time was like, particularly just, what Elizabethan plays were like. So it's filled out with a lot of broader history of the time, to give you an idea of the world Shakespeare was operating in, and does what feels like some accurate guesswork. I can't really accurately grade it, but it feels like it's done pretty well. One thing I really enjoyed was how the author would be able to pick out like a phrase that might be in, one of Shakespeare's plays, and that would reinforce an aspect of, like Shakespeare's biography. Like he would point at something and say, well, this is something that you wouldn't necessarily guess, like some kid from urbanized London would think this is something that would indicate, a deep familiarity with like a small provincial town like Stratford upon Avon, and he goes into great detail of this, some aspect of the Shakespeare's Catholic faith, which is pretty much all but confirmed that he was a Catholic, or he came from a Catholic family, to be sure. Final biography I listened to was James Joyce by Richard Ellman. This was both really enjoyable, and it was definitely a slog. It was nearly 40 hours long, and I do feel like it slowed me down a bit here in the kind of late summer, early fall. But it's a great read. It does include a ton of correspondence between Joyce and his family and friends. There are a lot of great nuggets. One of the just funniest things I thought was that when he was in his early 20s and just trying to figure out what he was going to do for money, one of the things he tried to do was sell shares in himself as a writer. So the idea would be that he writes stories and, makes profit off them, and he profit shares with people that, invest in him. And he went around and he got absolutely no takers. Everyone thought it was a dumb idea, and it is a dumb idea. But also it absolutely sounds like something that someone would do in the internet and online age. And the book overall is just this great surgical look at how he mined his life for his art. Just everything came from his life. Obviously inspired to read this after going to Dublin this summer, which you should check out my 2 Dublin blogs. That sort of nicely transitions into what other sort of Dublin Irish reads I had this year. Like I mentioned, At Swim Two Birds, that was one of my ones, this James Joyce biography. 2 other ones that I read this year were King Ghosthawk and the Birds by Amar O'Duffy. I believe it's pronounced Amar. And Dublinesque by Enrique Villamatas. King Ghosthawk, this was a great find. This is the first in a trilogy of book written in the late 20s, and it's a satire on sort of the vampiric capitalism of the time, and it involves this character named King Ghosthawk, who buys up all the songbirds and all the wildflowers in Ireland, and it involves this philosopher in his attempts to recruit sort of the proper mythological hero to come defeat King Ghosthawk and save Ireland. It's supposed to, I believe, take place in like the 40s or 50s, so it's kind of funny and goofy to see the predictions of what late 1920s Ireland thought was going to happen. And it works a lot like a Gulliver's Travel for its time. I have ordered the other 2 books in this series, so I will hopefully be reading those in the coming year. But this was genuinely one of the funniest books I've read of this year and of any year. As for Dublinesque by Enrique Villamatas, I actually lost my copy of this book on the plane back from Dublin. I was reading it in Dublin. That was like my chosen sort of in Dublin physical book read. And so I didn't get to it until much later this year. I might do a full video on this. We'll see. Both this and Bartleby & Co. Were huge hits for me. This novel in particular is about a retired literary publisher who kind of bemoans the fact that he's never found his one great masterpiece or one great author. And so he decides he's going to hold a funeral for the Gutenberg age, for the printed age. And he's going to hold it in Dublin on Bloomsday at the cemetery where Patty Dignam is buried. The title of this book comes from a Philip Larkin poem. There's a lot of intertextuality between it and the 6th chapter in Ulysses, which is that funeral scene, as well as a couple other literary works. And it sort of works, the novel does, as like a hybrid between sort of rambling literary critiques and novelization. Like, we get a lot of the interior thought of our main character is sort of his thoughts on, where literature is headed and what certain passages of different works that he's thinking about mean as he, goes on this little wacky journey he's made for himself. As far as a favorite, if I had a favorite book this year, I'd probably narrow it down to two, either Homo Sapiens by Victor Pelavin or No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. I read those both earlier in the year, and I did videos on them, so you should go check them out. My reading goals for this next year, I'm going to try and keep things pretty flexible. I do have a goal. I want to read one 1,000 plus page book. So some early contenders for that might be Antagony. I might actually get around to Divine Days this year. I think that would be really good. I'm also getting my copy of Miss Mackintosh, My Darling, hopefully from Dalkey Archive this year. And then a long shot, an almost 2,000 page book might be Saronia, Texas by Madison Cooper Jr. I also want to read at least one more Robert Coover book this year. I have had nothing but fantastic experiences with him, and I'm looking forward to it's probably going to be Prick Songs and Descants, but I've gotten like 3 or 4 more Robert Coover books this year, so I just need to read those ones that I've gotten. I also want to read, this is going to sound really lame, but I want to read at least 2 pre-20th century books. I mostly stick to like post-Joyce stuff in my reading life, but there's a couple different candidates that I'm thinking about. I got copies of Gargantua and Pantagruel, Moby Dick, and Tristram Shandy all for Christmas this year. So those are 3 options. I might also go for some Dostoevsky. I want to read Notes from the Underground, as well as perhaps The Idiot. We'll see. And then my final goal, I'm going to say, in addition to the 1,000 page book, I want to read 4 500 plus page books. I have a lot of big chonkers that I need to get through. And that's, I'm not going to name all the candidates for that. There's probably 24 that I have on my shelves. But I want to start getting on some of the longer stuff that I've neglected. Videos that are upcoming, or goals that I have, I guess, in the short term of videos to make. I do want to do something with The Passenger and Stella Maris, the new Cormac McCarthy books that came out, but there's a lot to cogitate on. I'm still thinking about it. I also want to do, like I mentioned, those mixtapes of Faces and Masks in Century of the Wind by Eduardo Galeano. I have another one that I've started filming is an overview of just some of my, not necessarily my top 5, but some of my favorite experimental novels or fiction. And I think that'll be a nice breakup in between sort of singular book reviews. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making it another year with me. Thank you for joining this year if you did. I really do appreciate all your views and your comments. I get very thoughtful comments on my videos, and I really do appreciate it. I'm not always super responsive to them, but this has been another fun year. I enjoy doing this as a hobby, and we'll see what kind of shenanigans I get up to this next year. Bye.